Because what I really want to talk about today is the question of AI and education, and in particular, thinking about what's happening with the pandemic and huge changes that has brought to the way in which technology is becoming essential for many educators, for many children, for many parents, for many families, and thinking about what that means in terms of a role for artificial intelligence. And from my perspective, thinking about how that brings different, or perhaps not so much different, but more accentuated requirements for creating a better connected ecosystem of people developing technology, particularly that using AI, people using it, people making decisions about how it should be used in education, people leading in education. And I'll talk a bit about that today, and I'll also talk a bit about some of the research that we did between March 2020 and October 2020 around the way technology was being used in education and how that influenced my thinking about AI and its role in education. So I will get started and look forward to hearing some questions from you at the end, if that's possible. Okay, so starting sort of from the basic, what are the implications for artificial intelligence when it comes to education, when it comes to educators, teaching, learning? I think there's one clear implication that's probably the one that most people focus on at the moment, and that is the way that we can use AI in education to tackle some of the challenges that we face, whether it's providing individualized instruction to enable learners to have the sorts of tuition that they need to perhaps remediate, perhaps diagnose some of the issues that they're having if they're having problems with particular areas of their learning, or indeed just to enable that kind of individualized, personalized interaction across a whole class of learners. Then I think there's also the implication that's starting to be recognized to a greater extent around how we need to think about our education systems, and perhaps think about how we alter the curriculum, alter the way that we go about teaching and learning, because we need to prepare people for a world of work and a life that is heavily and increasingly augmented by artificial intelligence. So I'll say something about how I think we need to perhaps adjust the way within education that we think about intelligence, so that we make sure that we're designing our education systems to encourage, support, and gender within individuals the sorts of intelligence, the sorts of knowledge and understanding that's not so easy to automate with our AI systems, so that we have a more complementary relationship between artificial and human intelligence. And then I think there's the piece about how we need to educate people about AI. And part of that is this idea of AI readiness. And I think AI is qualitatively different in this respect to digital technology that doesn't involve artificial intelligence. And I'll say a bit more about that when I get to this section. But I also think it's important to recognize that these three sorts of implications are not silos, they're not mutually exclusive, they're absolutely connected. And really we need to think of it as a sort of an ecosystem of connections that need to be supported and created and proliferated in order to help the use of technology to lead to a greater appreciation of why it's changing the world of work and our lives, and greater understanding about how we educate people, and all feeding into the other. But let's just have a quick look at the sorts of technology. There's a whole range of different sorts of AI technologies that are out there at the moment. So we have this kind of system that very much builds on the ability of artificial intelligence to be adaptive, to adapt to the needs of an individual learner. So these are two products from a company called Alelo in the US that originally was spun off as a university company many years ago. They specialize in conversational interfaces with an avatar. So the learner opens up their browser, starts the software on the left is called N Skills, and has a conversation in English as they learn English language. And the avatar and the AI adapts that conversation to the needs of that individual learner. And again, a university spin-off from Carnegie Mellon University. This is Carnegie Learning, and they have a whole range of different adaptive tutoring systems that can help students, particularly across STEM subjects and language learning, with these adaptive tutoring approaches. And then a UK company, Century Tech, that provides an adaptive platform for a range of curriculum subjects using classic machine learning approaches. And again, it's adaptive and can provide feedback for teachers, educators. It's not just school, the system can also be used in colleges. So that's the sorts of systems that really provide that adaptation to the individual learner by adapting the teaching and learning interactions. Then there's a whole other sort of raft of systems that are more in the recommender bag, and this is one called Filtered, which is more of a training. They specialize more in training, and this is a system, again, it has quite a nice conversational interface, but not a spoken conversation, more of a chat interface. And it's designed to help an individual student find the resources from a whole range of different resources that might be best suited to their needs for what they want to learn. And this kind of recommender system is also available for teachers who are looking for particular sorts of resources. As the system learns more about the teacher and the group of students that they're working with, then the nature of the resources that are recommended become more finely tuned. So it's not about tutoring, it's about recommending resources. And then increasingly we're seeing AI being used in the background of tools such as this, which is produced by a company that we worked with quite closely as part of our accelerator called My Cognition, and they're using little bits of AI to adapt their game. And this game, which is called Aquasnap, is designed to help develop what they refer to as cognitive fitness, but it basically works on general executive function, short-term memory, long-term memory, and attention. And the AI means that that experience of the game is individualized to the particular requirements of a learner. I mean, they do an assessment of the learner first, so they know where the strengths and weaknesses are. Then there's various game playing, and every so often the assessment is redone, and you can see to what extent you're improving. The tool started in as a clinical research trial, and it's available through our National Health Service, because the idea of this cognitive fitness was that it could be very useful for people who were suffering from anxiety and depression. And so the tool was originally designed to try and be a support, perhaps before drug treatment was necessary or combined with drug treatment, and it underwent quite rigorous trials as part of that process, but has now moved to be using in education because, of course, that cognitive fitness links well to learners' ability to achieve higher outcomes. So it's quite an interesting use. And then this system from university system, where the system is providing online counselling for students, and you've got the virtual avatar again there, sitting in the chair, and you can see it says University of Southern California, and you've got your picture of your avatar. And you can see on the other side of the screen a picture of a student who's having an interaction with this avatar, who's playing the role of a counsellor, and the AI is analysing the student's tone of voice, facial expression, posture, and various other real-time data sources in order to give feedback to the counsellor, so that the counsellor is providing advice that's more suitable for a student who's displaying perhaps signs of anxiety or not, or signs of being particularly concerned about some aspect of their life, it's useful for the counsellor to get that feedback about what can be learned from the way they're talking, the way they're moving, and the way they're expressing themselves facially. So quite interesting variety of different AI technologies at the interface and in the back end there, adapting and collecting and analysing data. And then just to make the point that, of course, AI is not just for adults and for school age, college age, university aged learners. We have this little cloud shaped room sensor from a company called Oya Labs, and another one of the companies we've worked with over the last few years, which sits in an infant's room and monitors the sounds, the conversations or the interactions with that infant, and then provides advice on the basis of analysing those interactions for parents about how they can better support their child's language development. And finally, an example that's very much about AI right in the background, not as part of the interactions that the student directly has with a piece of technology. So this is a company called Third Space Learning, whose mission is to provide one-to-one human tutoring between a human tutor and a learner. At the moment, they're focusing on maths and primary school age learners. And what they are using AI, and again, we're helping them with this, is to provide a way of analysing the different interactions that a student has with one of these human tutors to provide evaluation of these interactions as to the efficacy of these interactions. Now, at the moment, the company employs a large number of humans to do this quality control, because obviously for them as a business, it's extremely important that they can say, yes, our tutors are high quality and the interactions they provide are high quality. And that's a lot of a human resource that could actually be doing the tutoring. And so we're helping to augment that human evaluation with AI, and then also using that augmentation to support the tutor to become more proficient. So it's not just about monitoring and evaluation, it's also about increasing the skills of the tutor. And some very interesting work there being done, for example, around self-regulated learning and how tutorial interactions can support the student's self-regulation to a greater or a lesser extent. But really, I think the last year has been an interesting experiment that nobody ever planned, with the way in which COVID, certainly in the UK, I know the situation's been slightly different in Sweden, but right back last March, we had our schools closed for quite a long period of time, and they're closed again now. And all over the world, we saw lots of different sorts of interactions with home learning, learning anywhere, but actually in the classroom. And the impact of that is huge, academically, socially, psychologically, certainly well-being is a huge concern at the moment. And so we wanted to find out a little bit more about what was happening with the use of technology during the pandemic. And in particular, we wanted to look across the ecosystem, not just at schools or just at parents. So we started to conduct quite a complex study of that ecosystem with respect to the use of technology. So we started to talk to policymakers, parents, educators, educational leaders, companies, governors, trustees. We looked at a whole range of different data sources. Yeah, we did some surveys that were a set of questions, never taking more than 5 minutes. And then we did a question for the day, and then we're still doing a question for the week now. In fact, we're still collecting data. It's just that we closed off the data analysis at the end of October last year so that we could produce a report, which may be the first of a number of reports if the situation continues. And so we did surveys, we did interviews. As I say, we looked at Twitter data, and we looked at the other research that was going on at the same time to try and capture something about the whole ecosystem. And I can only give you obviously a taste of this. The report is now being published in 2 volumes by Cambridge University Press. It will be released next month, I believe it's going to be free, so we'll have it available on our website. So that's the Educate Ventures website. But it was interesting. These are the sort of comments that we got in the interviews that I thought quite interesting. You know, translating rather than really using technology to transform. So a step in the right direction, but obviously very limited in what could be done in short term. But actually, some very positive remarks there. It's been a real gift. It's almost been like 3 years of continuous professional development in 3 months, talking about efficiencies, opportunities for staff to use the technology more. But what we really noticed was that very little of the research going on looked at the ecosystem. Most pieces of research were looking at a particular community, whether it was learners, parents, a particular group of learners with particular needs, whether it was looking just at schools or whether it was looking at the home environment or just the home environment. And actually what became clear as we conducted the analysis was that the channels for connection and communication between different groups were really quite poorly impacted, or rather impacted a great deal and became worse. They were poor during the pandemic, and it really compromised the integrity of the whole system, and certainly impacted negatively on the ability of the system, the education ecosystem, to be self-supporting. I mean, a lot of it was exacerbating problems that were already there, but it certainly also created some new problems. And what also came through in the analysis was that, not surprisingly, not all members of the educational community and sub-communities dealt with the situation in the same way, to the same extent of effectiveness. And there were huge differences in the support systems that were available and the educational opportunities. And that enabled us to experiment a bit with some very basic AI modeling and pull out a set of personas, which I'll tell you a little bit about. They were aeronauts, earth movers, fire tamers, water pilots, and space seekers, as a way of trying to help to suggest ways in which a differentiated approach could be used to support the different sorts of stakeholders without obviously going to the huge and unrealistic setting of trying to provide something personalized for everyone, but trying to look at how you could differentiate support systems in order to meet the needs of these 5 different persona groups. So we had our aeronauts. They were more likely to be found in independent schools than state schools, and more likely to be found in secondary schools. They were very optimistic. They felt very well supported. They certainly recognized the value of technology and were ready to really get out there and push it and be quite innovative. Then the largest group, not surprisingly, were the earth movers, who were focused on the pedagogical grounding, concerned about keeping and developing the infrastructure that would support schools, very much wanting to promote well-being, which was great, and communication. This is much more the case in primary schools and secondary schools, and again, more in independent schools than in state schools. Now, the fire tamers were far more likely to be found in state schools, not surprising. Sorry, I said the earth movers were the largest group. That was incorrect. It was the fire tamers that were the largest group. And they were basically tackling huge challenges that were getting in the way of learning, really struggling often with poor tools, with insufficient infrastructure, really having a tough time, but actually solving a lot of those problems. And they were far more commonly found in secondary schools than in primary schools, and more state schools than independent schools. And then finally, the water pilots, who were very much a more luxurious group, far more common in independent schools, but evenly split between primary and secondary, where actually they were able to sail through the very turbulent waters. They weren't particularly tech savvy, but they were quite happy to engage with technology. They were much more concerned about finding the right individual environment for a group of children. And if technology was useful for that, then they were happy to get involved. And the space seekers, Again, more in independent schools than in state schools, quite a small group, more in primary schools. And this was very much about a group of individuals constantly looking for the right learning space for each child, very child focused. They knew how to do their jobs, and once they'd mastered the basics of the technology, then they were very, very capable of using it effectively for student learning. But those 5 personas are things that we're now working on with Cambridge University Press to think about how we could use that more to provide different types of support to different types of community member. Certainly it's not perfect, and those 5 personas are just a starting point. There was certainly real evidence of very poorly understood concerns. So really interesting to see the range of anxieties, confidence levels, optimisms felt by different groups within different communities, and the fact that they really were not accurately understood. And that certainly reduced the ability of the whole community to be self-supporting. So, for example, the most concerning factor for respondents to our various surveys was work-life balance, and not the falling behind narrative that was basically in the UK being hugely the source of conversation, that was the thing that people were concerned about most. They were close, but certainly that work-life balance was a big worry for parents, for educational leaders, and for educators. And certainly the confusing messages and guidance from the government was a cause of concern, and actually a big cause of loss of trust. And there's a figure later on that I'll use to explain a little bit more about that. And certainly when we looked at the edtech companies, who of course are part of the ecosystem, at the beginning of the lockdown, their primary concern was how they pay the rent on their premises. And this really changed because so many of them offered their products at reduced cost or free, and that meant that they took on many more customers. And actually their concern grew there to the fact that they recruited too many customers for them to be able to serve effectively, and they were worried about drop off in quality of what they were offering, because they were worried about being able to cope with the hugely and very quickly increased number of customers that they were supporting. And yes, the falling behind narrative was a concern. People were worried about children falling behind. That's absolutely for sure. But there was an interesting difference between, for example, the level of concern about that in single parent families as compared to non-single parent families. And the huge difference also in concerns for single parent families around financial issues, which were not commonly found in non-single parents. So real, as I say, emphasis on needing an ecosystem that's better connected, but also that recognises the diversity of the different sorts of support, different needs that absolutely are held within different parts of the community. And so thinking about being self-supporting, it was absolutely clear that parents who felt that they had really good, effective communication from school leadership were absolutely much more confident, in fact, 10 times more confident about the fact that their school was handling the disruption effectively. And communication between edtech companies and schools improved enormously. And it was interesting to see that the edtech companies, and we work with startups and SMEs mainly, they were certainly starting to be seen as sources of support and help, but it wasn't just the startups and SMEs. Large companies were also being seen as much more as a source for support and help. Lots of use of free technologies, and lots of use in education by educators and educational leaders of products and services that they'd never used before, which was a really interesting opportunity for them to try something new, and for the producers of those different technologies to get feedback from a different set of customers. It was really interesting that people were so engaged in trying new technologies. I thought it was fascinating that 74% of the educational leaders and 81% of the teachers that we spoke to absolutely were out there trying these new technologies and recommending them. And over the years, there's consistent data that demonstrates that actually the thing that persuades educators to buy into a technology more than anything else is the view of another educator. That's the thing that they take the most notice of. Certainly, teachers adapted to the pandemic remarkably quickly. And I love this quote, you know, as soon as someone learned how to do something, we would then share it with everybody else. So, I mean, we had some very basic training and then we shared. So it was just learning together and helping each other out. And this was what we found in very effective schools, where there was this very much team, self-supporting, community approach. Really interesting when we started asking who people felt supported by. So 30% of heads, teachers and parents felt supported by colleagues and school leaders. They also felt supported greatly by family members. Very, very, very few felt supported by the government. There was certainly an interesting correlation in the data between those who were enjoying remote education and the feeling of confidence about being able to sustain it, and between people feeling positive and feeling supported by colleagues. So that offering of support by colleagues or indeed by family members was extremely important for that feeling of positivity. And collaboration was as important for adults as it was for students. And so that also helped with that feeling of being supported and that positivity. There was also really interesting a recognition of opportunities resulting from the pandemic. And 54% of our respondents believed there was an opportunity to improve the use of technology for learning, which was very positive that, you know, there was this appetite. And we're going back to some of them now to see whether that's still being maintained as we're in our second lockdown here. But obviously, not surprisingly, huge disparity in technical infrastructure, lots of issues, and phenomenal difference between state sector and private sector in terms of the kinds of technology infrastructure that enabled different approaches to using the technology to be adopted. So difference between live lessons, for example, and not being able to provide live lessons. Certainly trust between technology companies grew in terms of the small companies, but in terms of big tech was very much weakened because big technology companies did not consider safeguarding issues. And that was at the top of most educational leaders' agenda, and it just wasn't being dealt with by them. And trust and lack of effective communication by our Department of Education and the government was absolutely rock bottom. With one of the leaders that we spoke to saying, I know there are points at which I get more guidance and I physically look at it and I can't even bring myself to open it right now because you just get saturated with it. And this was the figure I was referring to earlier. Now, this is just the timeline of the documents, some 226 of them that were issued from government agencies to educators between the period of March and October. Was phenomenal, and many of them were incredibly long. But this is a chart that really recognizes the conflicts in the information, just the conflicts in the information. So you'd get one piece of information one day, and even on the same day, you would get another piece of guidance that had something conflicting in it. And some of the things would have been so easy to fix. For example, the same document would be released with minor changes, but the changes weren't highlighted. And so a tired teacher feeling overwhelmed and knowing that there's a new set of guidance is now faced with another sort of 220 pages and wondering where the changes were made. And it would have been so straightforward just to highlight the changes, but it wasn't done. So lots of very simple things that could be done. And so back to thinking about ecosystems and being supported, we can see from that data that being supported led to increased positivity. We know that positivity was linked to confidence, and that was linked to well-being. So being supported was hugely important. And that notion of the community of the ecosystem, very strong. So what does that mean when it comes to the AI ecosystem? So here I've got that slide I used earlier where we're looking at the different sorts of implications that AI brings for education and thinking about how those are interconnected, and as you improve in one, then you're helping the others and so forth. So what does that mean for the bigger ecosystem? Well, I think we need to start thinking about this grey part of the circle there, and thinking about what we need to do in terms of recognizing the richness of human intelligence and the way that it's different from our artificial intelligence if we really want to use AI technologies to support that entire ecosystem, to help make those connections and help bring about a more resilient ecosystem. And so for quite a while now, I've been thinking about, and indeed that picture is actually the book that I published 2 years ago that was the early part and reflects some of this thinking, but it's moved on a bit since then, about the way that what we often refer to as the fourth industrial revolution is bringing about huge amounts of change in our work, in our life, due to automation and AI. And a huge number of reports have been published from the likes of PwC and McKinsey, Deloitte, trying to identify precisely where in the economy the AI automation is going to make the biggest changes, or what kinds of roles are going to be the most impacted, what kind of skills people need for the future, because that's where the impact is going to hit to the greatest extent. And in a way, I feel that those reports are a bit like trying to provide a map for the situation when actually one's driving along a very, very foggy road that I've never driven along before, very unfamiliar. So actually, when it's that foggy and I don't know the road, having a map's not terribly useful because I can't necessarily work out where I am. What's actually more useful in this situation is knowing that I've got a car that's reliable, that's got good lights, good brakes, the steering's not skewed, that I as a driver have got good sight, I haven't got hearing loss, I'm not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, that I'm a well-qualified driver. It's much more about that kind of approach to thinking about this situation that's very unpredictable. And that's only got more so with the pandemic. So in that situation, I think what's the equivalent of that reliable car, that reliable driver? What are those things? And what does that mean in sort of terms of human intelligence? And so I break it up in this way and think that, yes, there's certainly an academic intelligence, the sorts of things that we spend most of the time helping students learn in schools, colleges, and universities. But increasingly, that needs to be interdisciplinary. If we look at the advances in medicine and cancer treatment and diagnosis with the combination of physics and the human sciences around medicine, or we look at the pandemic and the need for expertise from multiple disciplines to work out how we deal with this enormous problem, then that interdisciplinarity is important. Meta-knowing intelligence, which I know sometimes is used to refer to metacognition, but that's not what I mean. What I mean here is really epistemic cognition or personal epistemology, understanding what knowledge is, where it comes from, how you construct knowledge, what good evidence looks like, and the need for good evidence to justify why you should believe something to be true or false, which in a world of fake news is even more important than it's ever been before. And then social intelligence, certainly as humans, I believe that we learn through social interaction, but that social interaction is also a fundamental part of our intelligence. It enables us to be effective at collaborative problem solving, and it also helps to boost our metasubjective intelligence. So going back to metacognitive intelligence, absolutely, as humans, we are able to become effective at self-regulation, to know about the way we're thinking, to understand how we can control some of our cognitive processes. For example, to know if I'm studying something and I'm distracted, to recognize that my attention has been drawn away and to know how I can pull it back to what I need to focus on. And we know that we're not necessarily naturally good at metacognitive processing, but we can develop very sophisticated metacognitive intelligence with support and training. Metasubjective intelligence, which is certainly more than just emotional intelligence, it's our ability to stand back and look to see and understand to what extent we are developing emotional intelligence or not, and the same for the people around us. Metacontextual intelligence, which I think is often completely underrated and certainly something way outside of AI systems at the moment, and that is metacontextual intelligence. So our ability to move often seamlessly between different physical and digital locations, interact with different groups of people about different sorts of subject matter, use different tools, different equipment, often without being remotely phased. And that's something that's just incredibly difficult for AI. If we think about autonomous vehicles as perhaps the AI example that's the most advanced in terms of that metacontextual intelligence. Nevertheless, the car can slowly drive. It can't play chess or solve a maths problem or act as your solicitor or give you advice or understand how you're feeling emotionally and all of those different sorts of things that our human intelligence is able to do. So that one's a really difficult one for AI. And then there's this notion of perceived self-efficacy, and certainly we need all of these elements of intelligence to have that accurate perceived self-efficacy that enables us to set goals, to know how likely we are to achieve those goals, to know what we need to do in order to achieve those goals. If we need to learn something, to know how we go about learning it. If we need other people to help us, who we need, how we pull them together, and what we do to progress. But as you can see there, really, it's only that interdisciplinary academic intelligence, some elements of the meta-knowing. AI can pull together bodies of evidence very effectively and can support some aspects of social intelligence and certainly can act as a collaborator, so emulate some sort of social intelligence. But really, all those other meta types of intelligence are completely beyond our current AI systems, and much of it will be beyond AI systems in the future. I should stress, I don't see those as separate intelligences, much as I love the work of Howard Gardner. I see it very much as different elements of a complex whole of interwoven elements of our human intelligence. And then there's this other part of this ecosystem that we need to build in order for this little ecosystem to help support that bigger educational ecosystem. And that is the part about educating people about AI. Now, certainly there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to help people benefit and not be damaged by AI. And I was lucky enough to found the Institute for Ethical AI in Education with my co-founder, Sir Anthony Selden, who's a lead educator in the UK, and Priya Lakhani, who's a social entrepreneur, because we were very concerned about the fact that there was great work going on in looking at ethics and AI and data and AI, but nobody was really holding the education piece. So we formed this institute in the autumn of 2018, and we formed it for 2 years. It's just been over 2 years in order to come up with a framework that would be useful for educators and policymakers, not just in the UK, but globally. And we will be publishing our final report next month. And again, that'll be available freely. And we certainly need to think about how everybody needs to understand something about AI. I was very struck by the Finnish approach to the sort of 1% project to try and enable 1% of the population to understand AI, and then that 1% helps another 1%. And so you grow a general community understanding of AI. But I think we certainly need to teach everyone something about AI so that they not necessarily, unless they wanted to, need to understand at all that anything about programming or indeed about the kinds of equations that sit behind machine learning, but so that they understand what AI can and can't do, so that they can use it to benefit themselves and can use it effectively in the workplace and in their lives. But that's sort of, we only really need a subset of the population to develop a deep understanding of AI, particularly people who are going to look after that kind of ethics in terms of the regulation, legal frameworks, and in terms of the technical understanding of AI so that they can build the next generation of AI systems. But that's a much smaller group of individuals. And so this need for everybody to understand something about AI led us to explore this notion of AI readiness as a sort of piece of glue to try and bring together a better connection between AI developers, and in this instance, educators, trainers, people working in education and training businesses. So I think AI readiness is for everybody, not just for education and training. I think anybody anywhere could benefit from AI readiness, but we're particularly concerned with how we help educators in schools, colleges, universities, but also education and training companies to become AI ready. And so we developed this 7-step framework called Ethical, as the acronym, deliberately chosen to emphasize that every step must be done in a way that's constantly thinking about the ethics of what's being done. And so the first step is about educating and exciting the community that you work in about AI. And so we tend to focus with this AI readiness on organizations rather than individuals. And so we work with an organization, try and help bring about an understanding within that organization about data-driven AI, about AI, good old-fashioned AI, and generally what AI is and what it's about and why it matters. And then we work with the organization to find a particular challenge that they want to focus on. We help them to identify and collate data sources that can help them to understand that challenge. We look to see if there are new data sources that could be collected to help understand the challenge even more. And we use some AI techniques to analyze that data, to understand the challenge more, and then learn about that challenge. Because I think people need to understand much more about their own organization from a data lens, from an AI lens, before they go about investing their resources in buying in some AI or developing some AI. So I'll just run through an example from higher education. It's obviously it's a very superficial run through because there's only a few minutes, but hopefully it will give you a bit of an understanding of what we mean by AI readiness. So we take the example of a university. And certainly one of the challenges that we've had is how on earth do you provide continuity of teaching whilst also maintaining quality and standards? And so if we take that as a challenge and think about, okay, how can AI help us to understand that challenge more? Because then if we understand it more, we'll be in a much better place to think about how AI could help us to solve that challenge, solve that problem. So here, the AI readiness focuses on the first part, the first question, how can AI help us to understand the problem or the challenge more? And so we developed a set of criteria that can help you to decide in that second step of the 7 steps, whether you are picking a challenge or a problem that might be compatible with the use of AI. So you can decide between different challenges that you're going to focus on for this AI readiness exercise. And these criteria, if we apply it to continuity of teaching and maintaining the quality and standards as you provide teaching in totally different circumstances, is assessment of continuity and thinking how you can support that continuity something that could be AI compatible. Certainly there's elements, we know that AI can be used in education, so there's a belief that it could be compatible. We certainly know something about the extent to which what's being provided largely through remote tuition is or is not being provided in a continuous manner, and we might know something about quality and standards, but we know we can collect much more and we can know much more. Is the problem controllable or is the context controllable? Well, not very. The pandemic's not very controllable, but some elements of remote education are controllable. Lots of uncertainty, certainly. Ought to have some data about this already, can certainly collect more data. How accurate can we be? Not very able to answer that question at this first iteration through that step through the framework, but as we iterate again and again through that 7-step framework, we can probably make much greater, more accurate judgments about how accurate we can be. And actually a really important question, does the institution have an appetite for change? So it's all very well going through this process. You might reveal something that says, actually, the change you need to make is over here, and this is where you should apply your AI. But if there's no appetite for that kind of change, then may not be much point in going along with this particular challenge and this AI readiness process. How important is it to solve this challenge for the institution? Well, I'd say continuity of teaching provision, maintaining quality and standards is pretty crucial to a university. And then we think about the data that might already exist, whether it is in human resources, whether it's video data, log data, whatever might be out there that could speak to the question of the kind of tuition that's being provided. And we also remind people to think about data sources they might not have thought about before, which might be video or audio, or even, if one was very lucky, some kind of multimodal data from facial expression or hand movements or voice. All of those things you can learn a lot about, obviously. And then you can drive towards this workflow, which is very much part of the 4, 5, and 6 steps of the AI readiness. So if you imagine that you've already got some data, and then you've looked to see, well, what extra data could we collect as we try and understand the teaching and learning interactions that are happening remotely, so that we can make a judgment about whether we're providing a continuously high quality educational experience. So we may be able to get data from questionnaires, behavioural data. Hopefully there's some sort of historical data, tests, interviews, videos that will give us some kind of benchmark. We might have log data from interactions or something similar. If we're very lucky, we might have some multimodal data, and we might have some button click data. And whatever data we've got, we need to pull together, clean, collate, organize, and then we can use some of our machine learning techniques to look at profiling these different interactions. So if you can imagine all of the different interactions that are happening remotely that you're trying to collect data about, if you can build a set of profiles and identify the key characteristics that differentiate between those profiles, and then look to see how these profiles are or are not connected to student well-being, student outcome, positive feedback, and you can really start to see the range of different sorts of educational interaction that are being provided in a much more manageable way. And you can see whether there are characteristics that you'd like to improve or to increase, to reduce, according to what the needs of the different student groups are, which leaves you as an organisation in a much better position to make a judgment about whether there is continuous high quality provision, but also a judgment about where you might want to use AI, which might be in one particular profile to boost a particular characteristic if that's been identified as something that really matters for the students and for the learning experience. And so finally, this piece of AI readiness is really about mapping the organization's data, information, knowledge, and wisdom pyramid, and looking at how you learn from the organization, with the organization, how you use the data to understand much more about the challenges that they face. You develop metrics for benchmarking, and then you're in a position to make much, much, much better decisions about where you will apply that AI. So this is really about building those connections and looking at how we can create self-supporting ecosystems. Because if we can generate this kind of AI readiness thinking that can connect to the better appreciation of what we need to do to boost human intelligence in order to complement the AI intelligence that we're already developing, and we can then use our AI very effectively in education, we start to create much more effective connections. If we have this AI readiness within the people who are operating the educational organizations and companies, they are in a much better position to make decisions about how they're going to use AI, where they're going to use AI, and how they're going to leverage the power of AI effectively. So just one last word about the Educate program, because I generally like to say something about it. Basically, it's a program we run for small organizations, startups, SMEs in the EdTech space, including those developing AI. It's all about connecting this golden triangle between people who develop EdTech, the people who use EdTech, and the people who can help you understand how you know whether it's working or not. The goal is the evidence, and it's all about that creation of that little ecosystem. And we're now looking to see, as we start the accelerator again next month, how we can increase the size of that ecosystem beyond our triangle, so that we do include a broader range of the stakeholders in our education ecosystem to support them, particularly in this time of disruption, but also beyond this time of disruption. Because if we can help to improve the data understanding about how AI is being used in education, how it's changing education, and how we help people to understand AI better, then we can certainly boost the extent to which AI, as well as EdTech in general, is used effectively to support that education ecosystem. And so, conclusions, absolutely, it's about ecosystems, not silos. Technology, but particularly AI, can help with building those connections that can support better communication and more self-supporting ecosystems. A great deal can be gained from studying COVID disruption, and we are absolutely out there collecting data again in order to try and understand more. And the best AI, or best approaches to AI for education and training, both in its development and its application, absolutely need these cross-connecting groups of stakeholders that work within this ecosystem, that isn't just the people who develop the AI, but it's the people who use it, it's researchers, and it's the outer ring of stakeholders as well, all of whom need to be AI ready to really contribute to that cross-stakeholder co-design of the way that AI should impact on education. And I'll stop there, though there are some references. I'll happily share these slides, and then that'll make those references more accessible. And say thank you very much for inviting me and listening. And there's a little bit of time left. Sorry, there's not more. It was me being late. But I'd love to answer questions if you have any, either now or I can answer them by email afterwards.